I just applaud Dan for pronouncing my name correctly. Okay, so what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about some ideas that have been in my head for the last few years, and I want to share them with more than just my own research group. So I titled this after, in memory of Mark Weiser's famous article, The Computer for the 21st Century. And I want to start by asking you if any computational technology once invented ever inspired you, because this has actually happened quite a bit in the history of computing. So we go back to the mainframe, and we have a small number of visionaries who presented the idea of automated computation, and it inspired a number of scientists to look into cryptography and other activities that were ongoing during the war. We move forward to the 60s and 70s, and a couple of individuals, Ed Roberts here and Alan Kay, and I particularly point out Ed Roberts here because it was his company, MITS, that did the Altair. That was one of the first jobs that Paul Allen had before he worked full-time for Microsoft, and those of you here know that Paul passed away yesterday. But many people were inspired by this idea of each individual having their own computational device. What inspired me when I became a faculty member at Georgia Tech in 1994 was the writings of Mark Weiser and the work of Andy Hopper in the area of ubiquitous computing, looking at devices of different scales and we being able to interact and own multiple of them. There's an image of me as a young assistant professor in the bottom right-hand corner. So what I want to propose next is an idea that I call computational materials. But before I get there, I want to challenge some of the assumptions that underlie the inspiration for some of these previous technological innovations. So what's influenced those past visions? Many of you are familiar with this individual. You might not be familiar with the formal representation of Moore's Law. The number of transistors you can buy with $1 will double every 1 to 2 years, and this is because of increasingly clever ways to manufacture integrated circuits at lower cost and with more and more components. One of the colloquial ways we understand this is this quote from 2012, a single iPhone 5 has 2.7 times the processing power of the 1985 Cray 2 supercomputer, which at the time was the world's fastest computer. And we've grown numb to these kinds of observations. In fact, the way we think about Moore's Law is that computers will always get smaller, cheaper, and more affordable. But I want to think differently. I think Moore's Law limits the way we think about how to be creative with respect to computing. And the key insight that I want to offer you here is to start rethinking what it means to create a computational device. Rethink the manufacturing process. So this is inspired by two trends that we're all pretty familiar with. At least this first one we're very familiar with in this community. And that's that certain manufacturing techniques like inkjet printing, roll-to-roll manufacturing are simple. And that simplicity, in contrast to complex integrated manufacturing, drives high-speed, large-scale manufacturing. But in addition, material science inspires a lot of ways we can think about what it means to be computational. I'm going to give you an example now of a very simple material, set of materials that when assembled provide the capability of an acoustic sensor, which sounds simple on the surface of it. We'll start with something that you're probably familiar with, though maybe not in these terms. The triboelectric effect, a very ubiquitous phenomenon in our everyday life. If you've ever combed a pet's hair, you probably will notice that as you draw the comb away from the animal fur, the fur flies toward the comb. That's because the hair of the dog, or human hair, and the typically plastic of the comb have an exchange of electrons because of a triboelectric effect that occurs when two materials slide across each other or come in contact and separate with each other. And this happens between any two materials. It's just emphasized between certain materials that are better at giving up the charge or better at receiving the charge. So here's an example of a 4-layer material. We've got paper on the top that has a copper layer on it, And then down below, we have another PTFE, a plastic layer with copper underneath it. So a 4-layer material, but I want you to focus on the middle 2 layers, the copper and the PTFE, because relatively speaking, they have an interesting triboelectric property. When the copper comes toward the PTFE, that contact causes the exchange of charge. And so the PTFE is negatively charged and the copper is positively charged. When we move that copper away from the PTFE, an electric field is produced, and if we connect that top copper electrode with the bottom copper electrode, we get a balancing of charge. You do this contact and removal repeatedly, and you get what's called a triboelectric nanogenerator, producing an alternating current. And this was discovered by my colleague Zhongling Wang at Georgia Tech a few years ago. And we exploit this. In a particular example I want to show you, we've got the paper with the copper with a number of holes drilled in. And I've got an example here of this material when mounted together. So you got paper with laser cut hole pattern, and the PTFE, or thin flexible plastic, with copper as well. The way you get contact and separation between these layers when mounted together is by providing a vibrating source. And the vibrating source, an example of that, is your voice. That incident voice causes micro vibrations in the patch in the middle, which we refer to as Saturn. The pattern of holes causes the amplification of this micro vibration, and what results, that alternating current essentially mimics the signal of the vibration. It's an acoustic recorder. You can see a poster and a demo of this Saturn work by my student Evedita Aurora downstairs. It was just before this session, and it'll be tomorrow as well. Now, there's more than just being able to get the alternating current to reflect the incident vibrational sound of the voice. You could produce a threshold detector and use this simply as an energy harvester. When you get over a certain amount of energy, you can flip and store a bit. You generate enough energy to store a bit in flash memory. That's one simple use. Some work inspired by colleagues at the University of Washington, and that many of you are familiar with, this notion of analog backscatter, being able to do battery-free communication because the incident RF signal from a series of antennas is reflected by another antenna in the environment, and that reflected signal can be modulated by the audio signal on the incident patch. So now we not only can collect the sound, we can transmit it to the cloud so that you can do something with that sound. That's when we start to get interesting. So how might you use this capability of having a flexible, passive, self-sustaining sensor that can, when connected to an antenna, can transmit the sound somewhere else? Well, there's a number of different use cases I can think of. First one is in this case of being disposable. You might remember that Weiser talked about the inch scale as being largely disposable technologies, but as we know in practice, those inch scale devices are anything but disposable. But now with something we can produce with these cheap materials, we can produce things that are very disposable, like a Post-it note. I can take a Post-it note, scribble a note on it, put it on my door, and when people tap on the note, can signal the recording of what is spoken to the note. So what I showed you in the previous slide is all we need to be able to transmit the audio of someone speaking at that piece of paper off to be recorded somewhere else. Come back to your office, take the Post-it note off and dispose of it. So that's a disposable use case. Another interesting thing about this kind of technology is you might be able to deploy it in places that would be difficult to do otherwise, or at least don't require as much infrastructure to be able to install. So the example I'm going to give here are some examples of battery-free sensors. So what we show up here is a current vibration or glass break detector. All it's doing is detecting the vibration of glass, and when there's enough vibration, as you would get when you break the glass, it will trip an alarm. And you can see here it requires some wiring into the window frame to some infrastructure to support that. We could replace that with something that's essentially a piece of paper that when a threshold value of vibration occurs, is incident upon it, when the glass breaks, it can signal wirelessly that there has been a breaking of the glass. And it's very easy to deploy that doesn't require any additional wiring. I'm on my way. I was at the UbiComp conference prior to here, and on my way there, I was at the Amsterdam airport, and this is a sign that was on the outside of the men's restroom. A little tablet device, basically, that has you press a button to indicate your feedback about the condition of that particular state. We can now replace this relatively expensive piece of computing with essentially a piece of paper that has a printed pattern on it that will do the detection of a tap, which is, again, an example of a vibration, and communicate that information to the infrastructure through the analog backscatter. So we have examples of battery-free sensing that we can easily deploy in our spaces. Another thing we can think about is a hybrid of paper and electronic examples. And the most compelling one I can think of is a paper electronic ballot. So the sensor I showed you responds to vibration. A pencil or a pen dragging across a surface is a source of that vibration. So you can record the electronic ballot on a physical piece of paper, and it can be communicated to the digital infrastructure. Anyone who looks at elections says that the best kind of technology is one that has a paper trail, but this also has the benefit of being electronic as well. Now let's think of enduring use cases. Take a floor tile. There's already floor tiles you can buy that have embedded RFID tags. And as long as you have a powered RFID reader, you can detect movement across that floor. But now we don't have to have the expensive RFID reader. We can replace the materials both of the floor and of the shoes that individuals use to be able to track someone stepping across a floor tile. And if your shoes are so instrumented, you can communicate who it is that was stepping across that floor tile. You might not want to know who's walking across, but if you have a young child in a mall, you might want to know when they wander off where they went. We think in another example of a more enduring example, look at the wrap you put around a building to protect it from wind and rain. Well, what if that wrap also was a sensor that could detect the wind, the stress, and the rain? This is possible with the kinds of technologies that we've been looking at. So, what I'm talking about here with these computational materials are self-sustaining materials. That means they harvest the power to do the things that a computer does. And I'm showing two examples up here. The top one is the Saturn example I showed you. The bottom one is one I haven't shown you yet, but I can describe if you're interested. But a computing device will store information, will compute operations, it will sense, it will actuate, and it will communicate within and between materials. But in addition to being self-sustaining, harvesting the power to do those things, in order to be really impactful, these computational materials need to be manufactured in very large quantities at very low cost. And if you're interested, I can show you why computing technology today, done with integrated circuit manufacturing techniques, is anything but large quantities at low cost. But also, they have to do interesting things. So, my vision to drive the future research and a potential alternative computing industry is to do something different from Moore's Law, which drove and dominated computing research and industry from the mid-60s to, I would say, until a few years ago, thinking always that the computer is going to always get smaller, get cheaper, and more powerful. Instead, my vision, which I think can drive us from now till who knows, is to think of these self-sustaining computational materials as things that will always get larger, always get cheaper, and always more available. There are a number of different research challenges here I'm showing. I call them the 5 Ps. I can go into more detail about those particular challenges to be able to meet this vision of computational materials. But what's important is to look at the 6th P, the kind of people you need to achieve this kind of vision. And it's not so much the individuals here, but the disciplines that they represent. And to the students here, I want you to be like my student Nivedita, who has taken this notion of interdisciplinary research to heart and has become someone who understands across a much broader set of intellectual endeavors than what we typically have in computer science. And with that, I will thank the other students that have been involved in helping me to build this particular vision, and I welcome a discussion. Thank you.
Hello, Albrecht Schmidt from the University of Munich. I really like this vision of ubiquitous computing going forward. But looking at your talk and the things you have shown us, and I think also a lot of things we have seen downstairs with the demos yesterday, is the question, why do we still study computer science in order to do those things? I think it's a lot of the stuff is material science.
That's exactly the point here. I absolutely agree with you. That's the whole point. That material science, chemical engineering, how you manufacture at large scale, as well as things that we talk about, electrical engineering, computer architecture, and HCI, those are all important, and you're absolutely right, Albrecht.
And so the next question is, I think, if I look at many of those things, the CS part, the HCI part, is really simple compared to the material science part. So should we not rather get sort of our students, the bright ones at least, towards material science and keep the others?
So it's interesting that you should say that, because this vision started in my head about 3 years ago. And it's when two of these individuals, the two just next to me, Eric Vogel and Mike Filler, representing material science and chemical engineering, came to me and said, well, in our mind, it's easy to think about the manufacture of these new kinds of devices, but we have no idea how to even think about what we would use this for in our everyday life. And I said to them, do you know who Mark Weiser is? And they said, no. I said, you should read the first 2 sentences of his article from 1991. So what we think is simple, other disciplines do not at all think is simple. We need to all come together.
Hopefully you're right.
That applause is for Albrecht's question.
Hi, Laura Olberg, University of Calgary, and I have a PhD in mechanical engineering, so go other disciplines. My question is for the sustainability implications. So when you talk about things that are disposable, the flip side of that is durability. So yes, we can put sensors everywhere, but how long will they last there? And then when they break down, what do we do with them?
Yep, exactly. So down the bottom here, one of the last challenges here, I list as privacy just because I was trying to be cute and have everything that begins with P, but it involves other kinds of values that matter. And one of them is sustainability. So in my use cases, I distinguish between things that were disposable and things that were durable. When you have things that are disposable, then you need to worry about, well, what materials are those made up of? If you just throw them away, what happens, right? So we need to be using not only cheap and abundant materials, but materials that can be reused or are at least biodegradable. The patch I'm showing you here has copper, PTFE, and paper. Not all of those satisfy that criteria. The durable, that's why I showed the picture of the house. That layer of Tyvek that goes around the houses, that gets covered with the facade of the house, never to be seen again for 20, 30, 50, 70 years. So if you're going to be successful with that, which I believe we can do, we have to accomplish 2 things. We have to manufacture it at very large scale. Tyvek is produced at the rate of about 8 square meters per second. That's how fast we have to produce that kind of material. But it also has to last for the lifetime of the house. So those are absolutely the challenges that we have to worry about.
Although even with the Tyvek example, I'd argue that maintenance makes a big deal. So if you think about what happens if you get a leak, a plumbing leak in your house, you still have to be able to locally rip out your floor and replace that section of your floor.
Yes,
so
that's exactly why I want the Tyvek to be a sensor that can tell you where the leak happened. So you don't tear off the entire side of the house, you tear off the part around where the leak occurred. So when we make the Tyvek be this self-sustaining computational material, and it can measure things like the water and tell where the water was, not just protect it, but show you where the water was, you have information that you need.
Well, then also if the Tyvek suddenly becomes damaged or is no longer working, you can also replace it back in there too.
Exactly.
Cool.
Hi, I'm Anne Roudot from University of Bristol, and I love what you say that we should embrace, interdisciplinary research. The problem I have, so I work a lot with material scientists and robotists. I have my postdoc somewhere in the room. She's a material scientist. And it took a lot to convince her to publish to Kai. And I really struggle actually to work with those people because we all have different venues in which we publish. Mm-hmm. So what do you think, how do you think this is going to happen?
So I'm about to write an article for the student ACM. Where's Girad? He's here somewhere. He's asked me to write an article that's exactly on that particular point. When you do this kind of cross-disciplinary work, I've been doing this for many years now, and I really enjoy it. But the secret is understanding what drives the other discipline or set of disciplines. I don't think it's as important that those people publish where we publish. We publish where we publish, and where appropriate, they can be co-authors and come along. But we also have to make sure we do things that advance their research agenda. And there's a very important kind of balance you have there, which is extremely important to understand and realize that it's a slow process. I have been meeting weekly with these individuals in this particular project for 3 years, and we just published our first result last week in Singapore. It takes time. It's well worth it.
Thank you.
Christopher. Then James.
Hi, Chris Harrison, CMU. So, what are we as an academic discipline if we're merely the glue that brings these different disciplines together, right? And all the ones you listed are all these two-word fields, which are already sort of interdisciplinary in themselves. They're not physics or psychology or all the single-word word fields. HCI is a three-word field. We don't have a good name for that. So if we're just a broker, and yes, we're good at idea generation, but is that enough for academic legitimacy?
All the real problems of the world require different disciplines to come together. I think rather than worrying about our identity, do we exist? Are we important? I think we ask ourselves, are we working on problems that matter? So I don't know what 2 or 3 word disciplines, Chris, you're going to identify yourself with, probably human-computer interaction. I identify with ubiquitous computing. It's all about trying to achieve some kind of goal where we want to be going, and it's not so much worrying about, well, am I a scientist?
James Fogarty from University of Washington. So all of the real problems of the world also require specialization, right? We have to be able to specialize our knowledge because of our own limitations and to have the depth to solve those problems. And so I'm wondering what you think in Moore's law. Microsoft and Intel had this contract essentially. Like the benefit was that we didn't have to figure out how to get the hardware there, but we could assume that it would be there. And you could build the next version knowing that 2 years out it was going to work. And so I'm wondering what, for those of us who are too stubborn or whatever to go off and learn materials engineering, what's the contract? Like that? What might it be? What can we start to assume if we think ahead through this?
The contract is very simple now. Moore's law is not going to continue. So if you think that the thing you have in your pocket right now in 2 years is going to be twice as fast, cost less, and occupy less space, you're wrong. So I think all of these kinds of advances that we've taken, I have plenty of slides that show how we've relied on Moore's law, and if you look at technologies over 30 years, it really has delivered tremendous transformation. We're not going to get that from now to the next 30 years if we think just about it's always going to be smaller, cheaper, and faster. That's not going to persist. But Intel has given up Moore's law. The industrial roadmap has been abandoned. So that's not the way that particular segment of computing is going. But I think this is hopeful because we can think of different ways of measuring our advancement as we go forward.
So I agree with you. And so that's the violation of the old contract. But what might the new contract be?
So the new contract, which is what I refer to somewhat selflessly as the project I have at Georgia Tech is called Cosmos, which you don't have to worry about what it stands for, except it's shooting for the stars. But I call something called the Cosmos conjecture, which essentially takes this notion of larger, cheaper, and more available and says every 2 years we can double on those particular parameters. And if you take that out 20 years, you go from being able to produce materials about, today we can produce annually about 3 square miles of silicon wafer integrated circuits. You take that out 20 years and going larger, cheaper, and more available, you can start to cover whole buildings with the kinds of materials that we produce. So it's just a different way of looking at progress of computational material in the way we looked at progress of integrated circuits. Not enough time here, I think, to give you a fuller answer, but that's what I'm thinking.
Thanks.
So I'm not wearing my moderator hat.
Oh, okay.
I'm wearing my old guy hat.
Good.
Because I would frankly, Gregory, I was really excited about your talk because that's the way this conference got formed. Because in the beginning, there were graphics people and there were compiler people. Yes, those people did exist. And there were psychologists. And there were a bunch of us that said, those are interesting things, but this human-computer interaction thing is all of those. And that's why this conference exists. And I firmly believe that the very interesting things in research exist where the boundaries of disciplines brush against each other. That's where the sparks are. So when you put this up here, I said yes, because if you look at the papers that have been published here in the last 3 or 4 years, the really exciting ones had material science in them. And they changed the shape of the electronics. And they changed the shape of the things we were doing it with. If we continue going with integrated circuits, we will never create the visions we've done in UIST as practical devices. We can't get there. We have to invent a new technology.
Touche, Dan. As usual, you said it better than I did. Isn't anyone going to disagree? I mean, James tried to.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, it's too late.
Ken, go ahead and hook up.
I want to renew Chris Harrison's question, and I actually want to pose it from my own identity, not asking who am I as a scientist, but who am I as a young researcher trying to tool up to conquer tomorrow's challenges. And I'll just give you a little bit of context. So I went to school and I graduated right into a recession. And a lot of the news coverage and a lot of the analysis that has come out of that has said, oh, everything you just learned is no longer relevant. And I learned that hard lesson right at the end of getting my degree. So in your vision where there's all this interdisciplinarity and we're working on hard problems, what does that mean for developing the skill sets even for a 5-year trajectory in which you can master the kinds of skills and questions that you would need to engage these topics to the extent to which you can make a contribution?
This always happens, right? I think every 5 years what we consider to be relevant from a computer scientist perspective changes, and if we want to remain relevant, we're going to have to be flexible and adopt those things. So I think resign yourself to the fact that the technologies that are relevant today will not be relevant in 5 years, and strive to surround yourself with people who are smarter than you, and don't be afraid to do that.
So 31 years ago, there was no UIST conference. And those of us that were interested in this, we just simply said one day we will make our own. And if you want to know how to make your own, if you can't find a home, call me and I will tell you how to do it. And I was your age when we make this conference. And sometimes you just have to do that. Sometimes you get friends around you and you say, the world is going to be different and I believe. And you just make it happen.